Welcome, speaker.
Yes, good evening. Thank you for coming. And I just thought I'd just begin just to say that, about the Ottoman Empire. So it was a very small principality that was founded in around 1299, but then by the end of the 16th century it was, from Egypt to the Crimea to Hungary and the Balkans, and the Middle East, and of course it gathered a lot of its roots come from Turkish roots in Central Asia, but the Turks moved through Iran. There's a lot of Iranian influence. They also influenced Iranian cuisine, and then the Arab cuisine of the medieval period, that's also had a strong influence, and the combined Byzantine influence and indigenous influences from Anatolia. So that's really what makes it such a rich and interesting cuisine, because it's got so much in it. And from the sort of 15th century, it acquired its own distinctive character. So it wasn't just a synthesis, a bit of this and a bit of that. They got their own character, the Ottoman character to the cuisine. So, for example, stuffed vegetables became a big thing. They stuffed everything they could sort of get their hands on, and sweets became a big thing, and sherbet and so on and so on. And a lot of also the etiquette around food was very distinctive, and so that's where sort of sophistication, its great interest comes from, because everything was related to food. So you were born, the special drink, and then you're circumcised, the special food and celebrations, and you marry, that's like that too. You get engaged, you die, and or all kinds of, there's a victory, the special food, the Ramazan, the special food. There's so many sort of food customs as well. So the whole sort of life revolved around food for the Ottomans. And the Turkologist Robert Dankoff, he said that the Ottomans saw their cuisine as reflecting the greatness of their empire. So I'll go on to this is hospitality was very, very important. Of course, in every culture, hospitality is an important thing. With the Ottomans, it was really something very, very central to the state as well as private life. So when the Ottomans conquered a town or a city, one of the first things they would build would be something called an imaret, a soup kitchen in a way, but it wasn't just for poor people. Travellers went there, or the people who worked. So they built a complex. So you've got a mosque and maybe a child's school and a university college, and all the people who work there are also fed at this. So it's like a sort of a university canteen, but travellers also eat there. The poor are welcome, that kind of thing. And that was very central to the Ottoman expansionist policy. So, for example, after conquering Iznik from the Byzantines in 1331, Sultan Orhan, who was the second Ottoman Sultan, he built an emirate there, and he personally distributed the first meal and to the Christian inhabitants. So also that's sort of getting them on his side. So he's showing them he's a caring, sort of paternal ruler. And then, like, for example, in 1397, there were 8 emirates in the city of Bursa, which is very near Iznik and sort of south of Istanbul. And in that year, said 1397, Johann Schildberger reported that poor people are received whether they are Christians, infidels, or Jews. And so by admitting people of all faiths and offering this limited range of typical dishes, because like an emirate, most of what they're serving is quite sort of simple. So it's a sort of a soup with bits of meat in it, a large piece of meat for each person, rice, quite simple food, bread, maybe some honey, that kind of. It's quite a simple meal. But there's the Ottoman historian Amy Singer says that they served as an Ottomanizing mechanism and contributed to developing a shared Ottoman identity, because right across the whole empire there were typical foods that were served in these institutions. So here's just a few pictures I found. Nilüfer Hatun was the wife of one of the sultans. I can't quite remember which, to be honest. Caroline, you remember? Orhan's was it? Yes, and then Haseki Sultan Emirate, Hürrem Sultan, that was Süleyman I's, the Magnificent's wife. And this is, I want to talk about these sort of the social life was inviting your friends to dinner. Men and women would do that, and also after dinner you have these parties in winter mainly called halwa sohbeti they were called. So it's a halwa party. And these were, you called your friends and you took it by turns, and this idea of taking it by turns can also, they had something like that in Central Asia, so you invited your friends by turn, your group of friends, so that goes back to quite ancient times. And you had entertainments at these things, so you had people told riddles, they sang songs, and they played very complicated parlour games. There's one or two interesting records of those parlour games, quite very complicated, and telling anecdotes, that kind of thing. So there's sort of this entertainment at these events, and the main refreshment was always halwa of some kind. Now, this was a particularly popular one. There's very simple halwas, of course, that you make at home, but this is a very complicated one. It's called linen halwa. Or it also has a Persian-based name, which is pishmaniye. It originated in Iran, and that means wool. It means wool sweet. But it's quite complicated to make. You have to really learn it from other people. You can't really open a recipe book, and it becomes this sort of fluffy, thistledown stuff. So watching other people do it was also part of the entertainment, because it's quite an event. I've watched it. This chap on the left is from a province called Kastamonu, a Black Sea, northern Turkish province, and this grandfather, people were very proud. You can see, his smile. You can tell, he's very proud. It needs a lot of skill to make this stuff. So he was helped by his relatives, his son and his daughter-in-law. And he's got that smile on his face because he's pulling, you boil the sugar to the right and then you pull it until it goes white, and then you have to put it in roasted flour. And the one picture on the right, that's from a village in a mountain village in southern Turkey. And there, the person who organised it was you can't really see it because I just showed their hands. It's quite a complicated process, giving that that fine effect. And the lady with the flowery headscarf, that you can't see her face actually, she was an old lady, she was the great master, they called her. Everybody else obeyed her instructions while they were making it. And why halwa was important? Because sweet things had a symbolic meaning, positive, goodwill, friendship, good fortune. And for example, the 16th century scholar Mustafa Ali said, "Every gathering should be flavoured with salt and every conversation sweetened with sugar." And okay, not everybody could afford to eat sugar, but so if you didn't, you could eat, you make do with honey. And if you couldn't afford honey, you make do with grape molasses. But sweet things were of great importance. A lot of the poets were forever talking about sweet things in metaphorical meanings. And so every single event, the rites of passage and all kinds of celebrations, inevitably you have loads of different sweets. So for example, when at funerals, and today it's same today, you have either little round donuts in syrup or semolina halwa, and you serve that after the funeral. That's still continuing. And Then in Ottoman times, when a soldier was killed in battle, they made a kind of flour halwa called warrior's halwa to commemorate the soul of the dead soldier. And then this is a hospitality ritual serving jam and fondant. And so the picture on the right is a lady serving her guests with coffee, but before the coffee you give some kind of sweetmeat, either jam or the fondant, and they take a spoonful, and then you have your coffee on top of that. And then also you would sprinkle rose water on their hands. If you're, once you get up into the elite, it becomes even more elaborate, the way you treat your guests. And and they also have the same etiquette in government offices. And in the 19th century, when the economy was in the decline, they're giving everybody who has some sort of business at a government office was also treated to coffee and some sort of sweetmeat, and they were presented with little embroidered napkins and it became such a huge expense they had to order them to cut it down just to a cup of coffee, and that was going to be it, to save money. And another aspect of Ottoman cuisine is that, of course, jams go back to much earlier times than the Ottomans, but they made jam out of everything. I mean, flowers, all kinds of fruits, all kinds of flowers, and for example, jujubes, green almonds, quince blossom, violets. These are ones you couldn't find today because you wouldn't find enough violets. It would be a shame really to take violets in such quantities. And the fondant was introduced to France, and the French were the ones who gave the name fondant to it. Actually, it was originally a kind of medicine that was sweetened with sugar or honey, and it became, over time, they cut out the drugs that were put into it and just turned it into a sweetmeat. And in Ramazan, of course, was very important food-wise because you're fasting all day, but then you have a really, slap-up meal once the sun's gone down. And this cartoon dates from 1914, and it's interesting because on the right, that seller, he's got a big basket on his back and he's selling these sort of round packets, and they're starch wafers called goulash, and they're still, you have to have goulash in Ramazan. You make it with milk and sugar. And so this is a puppet, a shadow puppet character called Karagöz, and in the cartoon he's shadowing that seller of goulash because he wants to find which house, a rich guy's house, which is going to have a really slap-up meal. So when he sees the goulash seller, if they're buying the goulash, he knows he's going to get a good meal there because rich people had open house in Ramazan. And the cartoon on the right, top right, that is again the Karagöz character dressed up as somebody who's gone out shopping for Ramazan. He's got his goulash in that packet wrapped with red ribbon, and he's got pastrami, pastırma, he's got jams in his basket, he's got preserved beef, that kind of stuff, all the sort of goodies. Everybody bought all the best things they could afford for their Ramazan meals. And the picture at the right bottom, that's a goulash wafer. I made it from a 15th century recipe in a steel saucepan, which isn't quite right. But anyway, it was just an interesting experiment with egg white and wheat starch. Yes, and then, for example, at wedding celebrations, you would, like royal wedding celebrations, the elite guests would be served sort of quite elaborate meals, several maybe 10, 15 courses. But there were other huge feasts were held for the soldiers and for the general public, sometimes a special banquet for women. And so everybody was fed. And I recently, earlier this month, I was happened to go to a circumcision celebration at a village, and you just turn up and sit down, and nobody says, have you got an invitation, or where did you come from? You know, it's just all comers. Maybe the presentation is not fancy, but we got 6 different dishes and baklava, and they fed a lot of people, you know, huge great cauldrons full of a thing called, anyway, I won't bother to go into the details of the dishes, but they're prepared for hundreds of people, and there were at least 200 or 300 people there. So that's quite, you know, it's a continuity, shows us a continuity. And when, for example, when children started school, even there were sweets were involved. So your child starts school, and the parents provide the teacher with a complete meal, and those small round donuts, again called lokma, in syrup for all the children in the school, and the kid who's the new kid is sort of paraded down the street with the other kids behind him. I suppose it makes him feel, you know, he's a good beginning to his sort of school life, you know, a sweet beginning. And and sherbet was very, very important. It's of course in English it became this strange sort of powdery sweet with carbonate of soda in it, so that it sort of, when you put it in your mouth, it sort of bubbles. And of course it comes originally from the Turkish sherbet, which was a sweetened fruit drink. And the simplest would be made of honey or grape molasses diluted with water and chilled with ice. So in this miniature, which is from 1582, at the very front of the stall, he's got several jars with different sherbets in it, and the white block on a tiny little sort of stand at the front, that's a block of probably very packed snow that's been stored over winter, and it becomes almost like ice. So when somebody buys a glass of sherbet, they would scrape off a little bit of some of the ice into the glass, and even apparently poor people could afford to buy a glass of chilled water or sherbet in the street. And they made, again, many kinds. So you make sherbet out of, again, flowers, fruits, whatever, you know, so many different kinds. And spices also, for example, like cinnamon. And the Venetians, who were coming and going in trade, they started making sherbet around the middle of the 16th century. And in 1577, news of this newly sort of fashionable drink reached the Grand Duke Francesco de' Medici in Florence, and he wrote to some contacts in Venice asking for the recipe for sorbet and other Turkish beverages. So that's the origin. It became known as, they call it sorbet. I'm not sure of the Italian pronunciation, but what we would call sorbet also developed. It's also a sort of a evolution of Turkish sherbet made of fruit juice. The Italians actually turned it into an iced dessert rather than a drink. And the other two pictures are just examples of, this is a tamarind sherbet seller in Diyarbakir in eastern Turkey. You can see he's got this sort of metal thing strapped around his waist with glasses in it, and he's got a big sort of sherbet container on his back, and he just takes a glass and sort of pours it out into your glass. And the same, this was in Istanbul a few years ago, we passed him, he was selling sour cherry sherbet. I think, can you see his sherbet thing on his back? Not too closely, but anyway. And so and the idea of using ice and snow to chill drinks, particularly, that was very, very important. I think that the Romans had done it. It wasn't that it was completely unknown, but in Europe it's sort of been forgotten. Like Pierre Bellon, when he came to Turkey in 1550, 53 or something like that, he was amazed to see the way that they were storing ice and snow through the winter. So mainland Anatolia is very mountainous, so every city has some mountains fairly near. So you make pits, stone-lined pits, or maybe you have a natural sort of cave, and you have sort of snow. They're called karcı, means a snow collector, let's say. And through the winter, they collect the really clean. After the first snowfall, they start packing the snow into these places, and it packs down and packs down and packs down. It becomes this wonderful sort of special crunchy texture when it's mountain snow. It has its texture of its own. I've tasted this on a mountain. It's not really like the sort of snow you get in a city. It's got some sort of more crystallized and a crunchy texture, and that gets packed down. And then when it comes around to summer, they started carrying this by camels or mules wrapped in felt. And for example, when Sultan Mehmet II, he went on a 3-week hunting expedition to Lake Terkos, west of Istanbul, in 1471, and they carried ice for him for 50 kilometers to where he was camped for his hunting expedition. And in the middle of the 17th century, one record says that they were consuming 780 camel loads of packed ice and snow at the palace every year. And they also collected in Istanbul, in particular places. I think they had 70 ice houses and snow pits in Istanbul itself, as well as the ones that were brought from the mountains around Bursa on the south of the Marmara Sea, and that was carried down the mountain and then by boat over the sea and then into Istanbul from there. And there's still a headland on the south side called Buzburnu, means snow, ice headland. And some philanthropists established charitable foundations for providing ice and snow to cool drinking water in public fountains. But European travellers were very astonished by this idea of drinking a chilled drink. They thought that it was terribly dangerous for the digestion, that you got smallpox and other diseases because of the way people were drinking cold drinks. And well, by the way, they were also very shocked by the way the Ottomans ate raw vegetables. So cucumbers were very, very popular. So for a snack, it's still true in Turkey today. You see sort of sellers with a whole stall. It's just cucumbers, and they've got some salt. So you just buy a cucumber, and they sprinkle salt on it. You just eat it. And it was in summer, it's sort of refreshing. And Europeans were very shocked by this. They thought that was very, very unhealthy to eat raw vegetables, lettuce. And they, in fact, some of them were quite funny. They said they compared Turkish stomachs were like those of horses and cows. They were so, resistant, how would you say it anyway, they had sort of good digestions, but the Europeans were so sensitive that they couldn't eat. And then this is a sort of like a cave that's used as a snow pit, because it's still quite common, not in Istanbul, but in some places in Anatolia, in fact quite a lot of places, you can still, they still put, they bring ice down from the mountains. I would love to go and see it, but it's usually very high up and you have to walk a long way. This is a proper ice pit, the one on the right bottom, you know, stone lined. This is just a cave that they use for it. Also, they pour syrup on it and make something called halwa, like a slushy. Isn't that what are children, that thing children like now?
Slush bottles.
Yes, it's like that, yes. And then coffee, of course, was very, very important. It wasn't drinking coffee wasn't an Ottoman invention, but they turned it into this big culture that was central to hospitality, rituals, and it became central to social life because of coffee houses opened, and so instead of just sort of meeting in the courtyards of mosques, which would have been how it was before, or if you were a non-Muslim in a wine shop. Now you have coffee houses which were perfectly suitable for people who didn't drink alcohol, or only drank alcohol in the privacy of their homes very quietly. And now you have these places you could get together, and they had these very fancy ones like this, and some for sailors, and all different classes, so everybody could have somewhere to go and talk, and so that was a huge change, and that was around, I think, coffee drinking began in Istanbul in the first half of the 16th century, and very quickly it became incredibly popular. So in 1585, the Venetian ambassador, Morosini, reported the favourite entertainment of all Turks, from the important men right down to the lowest of them, is to congregate in shops or on the streets and drink a black liquid called kahve, as boiling hot as they can stand it. Because the government was a bit wary of coffee houses because people got together. Of course, some people talked politics, so they saw them as sort of hubs of dissension. So over the centuries, they were very often closed down when they were worried about when the political situation was a bit dodgy. It was one of the first things they closed down. So sometimes they pretended. So you set up a barber. You set it up as a barber's shop, and you have a screen at the back, and you secretly carry on drinking your coffee at the back part. But like, for example, when one of the most serious bans on coffee in Istanbul, Evliya Çelebi was writing about the city of Bursa, where there was no trouble at all. The coffee houses were thriving. No problem. So it was really near the centre of government that they were most worried, rather than the provinces. And then I wanted to say something about water culture, because this is really something very, very important. Of course, people, even Muslims, quite often, I don't know what the percentage would be, but people did give, especially the elite, they were drinking among friends in their own homes. But it's not certainly not part of any public culture. So water and sherbet were extremely important. And people really valued the taste of water, and it's still the case in Turkey today. You know, you meet people, they'll go 50 kilometers every 2 or 3 weeks, and with their car boot filled with water containers, and they'll fill up with sort of 100 litres of water, because they want to drink nice tasting water from a particular spring that they favour. And in the past, this was a very important part of Ottoman culture, and so they have a lot of these drinking, public water fountains. Sometimes they're on a wall, sometimes they're sort of like a little pavilion. And also the states spent huge sums on providing clean water for the city. So in the 16th century, Suleiman the Magnificent made huge enlargements over the years. Different water lines, different reservoirs were sort of built up over the years. And he built a huge new system to add to the existing one, and his architect Mimar Sinan said, in place of water we poured gold and silver into its construction. It was so expensive, these projects, where they're carrying water for huge distances, and some of them are still in use, those water lines, those reservoirs of that period. Some of them are still being used. And in 1833 there was an American called Kay, and he examined Istanbul's water system and said that you couldn't build it in today's money, meaning 1833, for less than $50 million. And he was complaining that New York wouldn't pay anything like that, and they so desperately needed clean water, and Istanbul was so fortunate to have clean water. And another traveller said the same about Paris, that they had very little clean water, whereas Istanbul, it was so important, it was the clean water. And for example, this idea of the flavour, appreciating the flavour of water. So a traveller called Fynes Morrison, who was travelling in the late 16th century, he said that when Turks travelled, they sought out places to pitch their tents next to fountains or streams, which they no less know or as curiously search out as we do the best inns or taverns, not omitting to taste a good spring of water no more than we would a piece of rare wine. And similar comments are made by many travellers. For example, this idea, charitable foundations were quite an important part of the social workings of by the Ottomans. So one charitable foundation provided deliveries of snow to the local prison so that the inmates could drink cool water in the summer. And the next thing I want to, yes, there's nothing more to be said about it, but they have beautiful inscriptions. In fact, with Caroline, we went recently to a village, and she was studying a 18th century fountain there in this small village near Istanbul, and it had 3 inscriptions, and they were, it was founded by a woman, later repaired by a woman, and then repaired by a man in the name of his dead wife. Is that it, Caroline?
Exactly.
Yes. Yeah, yes. That's very interesting, and they're very beautiful, these fountains. And they're sort of the equivalent of statuary in Europe, beautifully carved. And this, I wanted to talk about food as gifts, because this was a very, very important part of Turkish culture. So this picture on the left is shows, I think he's some official working for the Grand Vizier, I think, and he's carrying a tray with vases of flowers, which were very important to the idea of giving flowers, and fruits. So you said that you want to send a gift to somebody you know, just to say, how are you, as a gesture that you've remembered them, and you send flowers and fruit. And this goes back very early in Turkish tradition. So in the 7th century, the Göktürk ruler sent bunches of fresh mare's nipple grapes as gifts to the Chinese Tang emperor. And this was those grapes were sent fresh for a distance of 2,000 kilometers over mountains and deserts. And there's other examples from Central Asia, pre-Ottoman examples. So most people were very interested in their gardens. So you had some, even in a modest scale, at least, even if you have a small garden, you've got fruit trees, and you would choose your best fruits to send them to your friends, or to state officials. Perhaps you want to keep in with them. And for example, in 1898, Abdülhamid II sent several chestfuls of these tiny akça pears, the ones on the right. They're very tiny, they're very tasty pear. And he sent them to Emperor Wilhelm II, who was paying a state visit to Istanbul at that time. So everybody was doing it. And I think, because I suppose it's because it's something that it doesn't have really a monetary value, because of course there were in fact shops where you could buy fine fruit. So some people paid for them, but really you're supposed to you give them from your garden. So it's something, it hasn't got any monetary value, but it's got a great deal of spiritual value when you give a present like that. Whereas if you gave something that I don't know, a gold ring or something, or some precious textile, you have to be rich to do that. Whereas this kind of giving some fruit from your garden, everybody can do it, and it means more. The fact that you've grown it, when foreign ambassadors arrived in Istanbul, they were greeted with presents of fruit and flowers. So when the Holy Roman Ambassador arrived in Edirne in 1665, the government sent him 30 baskets of fruit. And in 1741, 40 baskets of fruit and 5 trays of garden flowers were presented to each of the newly arrived French, Iranian and Russian ambassadors. There's millions of examples of these, I just picked 2. And they could also express condolences. So, for example, when Selim III's young daughter, she was 3 years old, she died of smallpox in 1791, he received 100 baskets of fruit and 32 baskets of flowers as a gesture of condolence. And then when there was a fire in the area known as Galata, across the north side of the Golden Horn, that was where almost all the ambassadors had their embassies and residences, and there was a terrible fire there because the buildings up to that point in that area were made of wood. And in August 1831 there was a terrible destructive fire, and the Ottoman Foreign Ministry sent fruit, sweetmeats and flowers to the foreign ambassadors as a gesture of condolence for damage and destruction of their buildings. And individuals also, they sent gifts to their friends, so especially sweet things like baklava and other sweet pastries. So there's some Ottoman recipes, and sometimes they say, this recipe will last for sort of 15 to 20 days, it won't spoil, so you can send it on long distances. And there's some letters, I think it's the mother of Sultan Abdülaziz Pertev Nihan Sultan. Her letters are in a library in Istanbul, and a lot of her letters are thank you letters for food, and there's even things like yogurt. People would just send yogurt, to the Sultan, and she was the one who always answered. So once in a while she says, my son tasted it, he thought it was very nice, but most of the time she just says thank you. I suppose they really wanted it to go to the Sultan, but that's quite rare. But all these thank you letters are for all kinds. I mean, of course, there's lots of fruit and things, more traditional things, but there's also yogurt, pickles, and one letter she was thanking somebody for a swordfish that they sent. And then there was a huge influence, Ottoman influence on European cuisine, in fact. And there's many, many examples, and so many of them have sort of been absorbed that they're not so sort of obvious today, although the coffee is very well known, and maybe the sherbet too, but there's many other things, like watermelons were called Turkish, what were they called, Turkish gourds, things, there's so many, and of course now they're not, but when they first arrived, so many of them were described. And Hungary is an interesting example, because Hungary was part of the Ottoman Empire for 1.5 centuries, but it was a very, very important sort of conduit for Ottoman influence on Germany and Austria. And so, for example, this on the left is nougat on a stick, and I bought these. A friend of mine who's German went to Germany on holidays, visit her parents, and she bought these over the internet. And they're still called Turkish honey. in southern Germany and Austria today. And in Hungary, they're also called Turkish honey, and I won't be pronouncing it correctly, but Törükmez. And this shows, of course, nougat wasn't an Ottoman invention, it was something that goes much further back. But for Central and Northern Europe, the canal for this was again the Ottomans. And another example is on the right. This is a picture of a Turkish sheep in a German cookery book from the 16th century by Max Rumpold. And he has a whole chapter headed by this picture, and he has 15 recipes based on Turkish kebabs and that kind of thing, made with mutton from the Turkish sheep. And this was although the tail looks a bit stringy there, apparently it was the fat-tailed sheep, a large fat-tailed breed of Turkish sheep, which moved through Hungary, again into Eastern Europe. And that book also has stuffed gourds as well, stuffed with rice. And the Ottomans introduced, for example, into Hungary, they introduced rice farming because they couldn't live without rice. So in southern Hungary they set up rice plantations, and so in Hungary lots of rice dishes moved from the Ottomans into Hungarian cuisine. Apparently the rice plantations went after the Ottomans were kicked out by basically it was the Austrians moved in and the Ottomans sort of moved out. And then, in the rice plantations didn't survive, but apparently researchers, quite modern researchers, have shown that that they introduced a lot of, very important, horticulture. It was so a lot of new fruits that the Hungarians didn't know, or new fruit varieties, and vegetable growing. And apparently the same areas that the Ottomans set up as gardens around all the towns in Hungary are still orchards today very often. And there was quite an interesting research into the apricot, because apricot comes from Central Asia, but the apricots that the Romans knew, which came, I think, I don't think it was known before that. It was, you just throw a seed down and you get something which in Turkish is called zerdali, actually it's from Persian. But of course the apricots that we mainly eat now, they're grafted. And the grafted apricot was brought by the Turks from Central Asia, they had huge plantations in Turkey, they took it to Hungary, and I think in the 1990s there was a big study done of genetic study of apricots in Hungary, and they were all from Turkey, and some of those varieties went to Europe, which is very weak in terms of its genetic diversity in apricots. To back up that that genetic evidence, for example, in 1551, the Bishop of Augsburg ordered apricot scions, the cuttings, you cut off, do the grafting, from Hungary. And even more telling is the fact that Turkish is the only language in the world which has a separate word for the grafted apricot. It's called kayısı. And all that word kayısı is in Romanian, Hungarian, all the Balkan languages, in Persian. It's the only language which has a specific term for the grafted apricot. And just to finish up the Hungarian influence, for example, baklava, of course, was taken to Hungary, and then it became a sort of strudel. It's sort of based on that. It was originally called, like Max Rumpold, he calls them Hungarian tarts. So they know that the strudel came from Hungary, and the Hungarians, of course, it metamorphosed on its way, it changed, and they still have many food words from Turkish in Hungarian, like bulgur, çorba for soup, turşu for pickles, tencere for a cooking pot, bıçak for a knife, dates were known as Turkish plums. maize as Turkish wheat, paprika as Turkish pepper, runner beans as Turkish beans, which shows, it reflects the very, very strong influence, Ottoman influence of that period. And this is just to show that women, sometimes it's so easy to sort of think, oh well, they had to put on veils and nobody saw them. But in fact, women actually led quite full lives. Of course, they didn't get together with men and in these evening parties. They had their own. Men had their own. But they were often out there, so if the Sultan had a wedding or a circumcision, they had these huge festivities. Foreign travellers describe, the hillsides around where they had a good view, actually sort of covered with women observing it. And picnicking was one of the big things for women's social life. So apart from inviting your friends to dinner and they would go out picnicking, and picnicking is a big thing still in Turkish culture. Picnicking is a really important thing, and so everybody liked eating outdoors in their garden or around cities. They have public parks. And for example, in the 17th century, Evliya Çelebi lists the public, the parks, the pretty places with a nice view, with some trees for shade, maybe a stream. So you can't need water. You can't have a picnic unless you've got you've got some water to drink. Meanwhile, and every town had many, scores of these places. Istanbul had, in the 17th century, had 52 public parks where people went, and some of them they had little summer houses built there, so you could sort of sit inside those and sort of sit with your friends and have a cup of coffee, or you took your food with you to these places. And the most famous was on the Golden Horn. There was one very famous large one, and on the Bosphorus also. And you travelled, like women travelled in these ox-drawn carts, very decorative ox-drawn carts, if you're wealthy enough. If you're not, you could ride a donkey, or you could walk to wherever was the nearest one to you. And on the right is that's a picture of, I think it's early 19th century. This is women enjoying a sort of day out on Kağıthane, at the end of the Golden Horn. In fact, I think it shows some men in that picture too. In fact, it was usually, either the men had to keep away from the bit where the women were with their children, or they had separate days as well. And women had dinner parties, and there's a very interesting account. Of course, you don't get many accounts of these, of course, but in the 19th century, there was an English archaeologist called Ramsay. I can't remember his first name. Alexander Ramsay was it? Anyway, his wife. William. William Ramsay. Right, his wife was met a local lady at a town called Shuhud in central Turkey, where her husband was doing his excavation, and this lady invited her to dinner. And there were 11 guests. And it was a dinner of many courses, but poor Mrs. Ramsay was not aware of the way the Ottomans ate. And how they ate was, if you're in the elite, we're not talking about a simple village repast here, this is a wealthy lady, and she's giving a many-course meal, and you only just picked each dish is brought, you have a little taste, maybe one or two little tastes, and it's whipped away and then another one. And you have a little taste, it's whipped away, you have another one. And this goes on like that, and interspersed with the savoury dishes, you had sweet ones. So you had sort of 3 or 4 savoury dishes, followed by a sweet dish. And poor Mrs. Ramsay didn't know this, and so she ate plenty of the first 3 dishes. I think one was roast lamb stuffed with rice, with almonds and some stuffed vegetables and whatever the third one was, and she ate her fill, unfortunately. And then came the baklava, and she enjoyed that too. But the meal went on and on and on. And poor thing, you know, you feel sorry when you read her account. She said, but the dishes kept on coming in hideous succession till I lost count of them. You really feel for this poor lady. And yes, anyway, that's the end of my talk actually. I just wanted to say, yeah, it really had such a broad influence. Did I remember to say what that the Austrian, he's actually an expert on Iranian history, Bert Fragner, and he called it the Ottoman Culinary Empire, because and he says the Ottoman Empire has disappeared, but the Ottoman Culinary Empire still exists. Because you go to Lebanon, Egypt, Crimea, the Eastern Balkans, and it's a shared cuisine. Of course there are regional differences, but very much a shared cuisine, and many of the things that people are eating in this region are dishes that came to the fore in the Ottoman period, like bulgur. There's really no record. It must have existed, because it sounds like an ancient technique of making bulgur from wheat, but bulgur appears as an important part of the cuisine only in the Ottoman period. The same with those strand pastries, you know, the ones where they, like, what's that wheat? Shredded wheat.
Kadayif.
Yeah, kadayif, the one in the shredded type of kadayif. That only appears in the Ottoman period, and it takes over from the original Arab kadayif, which was like a Scottish drop scone.
Oh.
What in English, a traditional, not a muffin, what are those others?
Crumpets?
Crumpets.
Yeah.
Actually, they're thin crumpets, and that was the original kadayif. But the Ottomans, for them, the one made in the strands became important. And there's so many things like that, so many examples. And even, as I say, in Europe, you can still find many traces of their impact. For example, you go even further from the Central Europe into Scandinavia, where of course they have meatballs, which was an Ottoman thing, and what was the other thing they have? Oh, they have stuffed cabbage leaves, and those entered the Scandinavian cuisine when Charles XII, in the early 18th century, he was defeated by the Russians. He had to run away. He took his men, sort of hundreds of men, with him, and he took refuge in the Ottoman Empire. He was there for, I don't know, 8 years, 8 years, and finally he managed to set off back to Sweden, and apparently he'd run up huge debts to everybody, including the Sultan, and the debtors went with him, and they ended up taking the meatballs and the stuffed cabbage rolls. And I asked my Danish friend, for example, because I could find on the internet the Swedes call them dolma or dolmar or something. And her relatives also call stuffed cabbage leaves still dolma, which means stuffed in Turkish. So it really, it went, these huge ripples went out everywhere. So thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. That's splendid overview. There may be a glass or two left if anybody would like a bit more. So why don't we just pass it around? Here's a bottle of bread. Why don't I just pass that around?
I'm fine. Spritzer. I'm good. No.
That was really absolutely fascinating. Could I just ask, do you know much about the domestic Ottoman eating habits, as well as the prestations which are really
Well, of course, the Ottoman archives are so much about the palace, and getting personal details. The best thing is for foreign travellers, because they were very interested, but on the other hand, some of the foreign travellers, they didn't really get into people's houses.
Yeah.
Unless they were, Christians were perhaps likely to accept them.
Yeah.
Of course, their cuisine was, was very little different, really. It's quite hard to get into people's houses. But in the later period, of course, a lot of people like Julia Pardo. She was an perhaps perhaps not an aristocrat, but a very upper class lady, she got into places where, you know, the Ottoman upper class would accept her. And there was also a painter called Mary Walker, for example. She did portraits of Ottoman women. She lived in quite, you know, one of the Sultan's sisters' palace for quite a long time doing portraits. She got into it. It's a bit like in poetry, you get glimpses. That's why poetry is quite important, because if a poet talks about a custom, like taking rose jam to an ill person, you visit your sick friend and you take some rose jam, because roses have a health-giving quality. We wouldn't think that was a very good thing to take to a sick person, but then, you know, the roses are very important. And in fact, a professor I know, medical historian, Ayten Altuntaş, she's done a lot of research on roses, because it genuinely does have some quite curative effects, of course, roses. But that's in a poem. When you read it in a poem, you can be pretty sure that maybe not the poorest of the poor, but if they talk about a custom like that, it's something that ordinary people were doing. Otherwise, why would they bother to write about it in a poem? So, I mean, you can sort of get a little bit into, you know, the non-royal how homes are big, and also from court records. You know, like people have fights, or they complain about their neighbour doing this, or a shop that they've gone into and they didn't think the food was up to much, and so you know, you get your sources. There's quite a lot of sources. Yeah, getting into private homes is not as easy, but it's not impossible either.
Yes,
we could come see each other.
Yes. Well, who would like to discuss?
I've got a question. So I've always been fascinated by pişmaniye, because from the first time I went to Turkey, which was so long ago I won't tell you, until now, and I go a lot by bus, you get to Izmit, and these guys come on, selling pişmaniye, 3 boxes of this stuff for like 10 lira. I mean, it's dirt cheap. Is it pure sugar? And well, but also the other thing is, when did sugar come to Turkey? I mean, presumably after the Americas. When did sugar first come? And did they use honey before that?
No.
Or were they using beet?
No, beet is a very late development, and they knew that beet. Of course, there's lots of different plants that have a sugar content, but you want a plant which has a lot, which of course really sugar. You know, the cane. Of course, the sugar cane is the best source, of course, but it literally pours out, doesn't it, when they squash it. But beet came in sort of after Napoleon, because I think, you know, the British and the French were at war, and the French were blockading the ships, and the British had the control over the sugar trade, so they were deprived of sugar. So Napoleon said, get on with this beet project quickly. And of course, you could grow beet anyway. You didn't need a tropical climate to grow beet. But the Turks knew sugar very early. Of course, it was more of the elite. It was a luxury product. But in Central Asia, what's that Chinese traveller? Huan Chang or something. Anyway, I think he's 7th century, and he's got his long travelogue, and he was received by the Göktürk ruler, who invited him to a fancy banquet, and one of the things they were served sugar candy and honey sticks. And so, in fact, they were growing sugarcane in Afghanistan of all places. It was some sort of microclimate in a place called Lamga. And then, so there was sugar, and then the Arabs took it sort of westward. So there was tons of cane being grown and sugar being produced in Iran, in Khuzestan, and in Damascus, in Syria, and of course Egypt. Now there was always Mevlana in the 13th century. He often mentions sugar, and very early on they had sort of sayings like, you know, eat sugar, talk sweetly. From the 15th century, at least, you've got these sayings. So it wasn't just a few. You know, a few very appreciative people. At least anybody with a little bit of money could buy a little bit of sugar for a special occasion at least.
But it didn't go west from there, as I understand it much. I mean,
What, the cane sugar?
no, this sugar you're talking about, yes. I mean, when did it come into Europe? I mean, it's into...
Well, because I think the Mamluks were controlling at first the sugar trade from Egypt, because that's a very big producer, and then during, I suppose, the Crusades, the Europeans were desperate to grow their own sugar because they were fed up of paying high prices to the Mamluks for it, and so they started growing it in Sicily, and then where else? Cyprus, Madeira Islands, and then.
Okay. Just tell me, what's in Pishmaniye apart from sugar?
What's in Pishmaniye?
Just
First
looks,
you
it's
boil
really cheap
up
and
sugar,
never
and
buy
then
it.
you pull it
It is sugar.
and make a ring. And that's just pure sugar and
It is.
water. So, you know, the way you make all kinds of sweets, but pulled so it turns white. And meanwhile, you've roasted flour with lots of butter. And the trouble is with these commercial varieties, they sell for sort of 10 liras a box.
Yeah.
Is
10 liras for
they use, oh my goodness. You can't, the real thing is wonderful, it's just gorgeous, and it's got real butter in it. But what the trouble is, they use these cheap commercial fats to bring the price down. I've met people, you know, I said, what's your favourite sweet? I said, well, Pishmaniye is one of them. I think it's absolutely delicious. And they say, well, we taste it, we didn't like it. And then you eat a cheap one, and then of course you wouldn't like it.
So it's made in factories now in Izmit, presumably?
Well, I think they have to be able, because I think they've got a machine. They've got a machine which sort of, somebody sent me one over Instagram, so they sort of invented this machine. So actually you sort of pull it by hand, so the ring gets bigger and bigger, and then you make a figure of 8. And then again, with it, you put it into your roasted flour, with the buttery roasted flour, and then 3 people or 4 people sit around, you sort of pull into it, the ring gets bigger, and you make another figure of 8, and then I wrote an article about it once, and I said, well, you end up with a sort of, you start off, you've got 1 ring of sugar, about that thin, but after doing all this folding, time after time after time, you end up with this sort of thistledown stuff, about 10,000 little strands, right? And the person who I was the editor of this book, she said, yeah, 10,000, she said, yeah, are you sure, right? I said, well, I'm not sure. I sort of really found that figure more or less over the top of my head, because you get 2 strands, 4 strands, 8 strands. Actually, when you do it sort of 15 times, you end up with sort of 1,000 strands. And I just sort of a bit made it up, I'm afraid. Anyway, my brother-in-law was there, he's a physics professor.
Okay.
So I said, they fold this thing at least 40 times, usually 45. And I said, can you calculate it? And it was over 1 trillion strands. And they bought at 10,000 strands, and he calculated it as it was more than 1 trillion, it was 1 trillion point something. Wow. So that's why it's so fine, finer than hair, and the good ones are so delicious, I mean. Yeah. And the amazing thing is that people made it at home. It wasn't professional, it's not professional confectioners making this thing. People are proud of, you know, it's sort of a fun thing, you know, you get that expertise, you're proud of it, and you do it at home. Amazing.
So where can you buy it in Istanbul, the real thing?
Well, there's only one brand I like, and I haven't seen it in Istanbul for a long time because it makes such a lot of money. All these little confectionery things have sort of jumped on the bandwagon. I used to get it, there was the first sort of really commercial brand was from Madurno. It's a little town near Bursa, and theirs is very nice. And I used to sometimes order it when I couldn't find it. And they were the ones who called it Palace Halwa. Of course, that's just a selling point. It's not its real name. But everybody jumped on the bandwagon. They all call it Palace Halwa. If you the really really fine one. The Madurno one is the best. I think you have to. Yeah, it's a shame really. I mean, I've tasted several that really I didn't think were worth eating. It's a pity. And so it's a bit pot luck really.
You can actually buy it in Selfridges.
Can you?
Well,
I wonder what make it is. Is it good? Have you tasted it?
No, I haven't, but I've seen it, and I think there's at least 2 different brands.
Yes.
I haven't bought any, but I have seen it.
Yes, I mean, if it's the real thing, I think look and check if it's real, if it's got butter in it.
Yes.
is worth buying.
It's delicious. Lots of calories. Yeah.
Staying on the topic of pishmani,
Yes.
it's very interesting to hear you speak of the etymology of the word being Persian, because
Yes.
of course in Turkish pishmanlık is something one regrets. So I always thought, you know, it's the sort of thing, it's so delicious, one could very easily get carried away having far
Yes,
too
I think
much.
that's just a play on words, you know,
Yes.
because you know, Iranian people, Turkish people, they love plays on words. So actually, it comes from peshim, which means wool apparently, and then pishmane, peshmane, you get words like that. And then somebody had the bright idea, it sounded fun to call it pishmaniye, but when, I can't exactly tell you. It's just a joke, I think, really. Yeah.
Well, there was a question here first, I think. You wanted to say something?
Well, you preempted me, but I was going to ask about the sugar as well.
Oh yeah.
Do we have good records for the palace cuisine? Like how much and the type of food they cooked and how different it was the food that the general population ate?
Yes, I mean, there's lots of course, there's millions of documents in the archives, you know, especially of the sort of like there's menus that Hedda Reiner Kiel, you know, this German researcher, for example, she found lots of menus, sometimes with a few details about how they were made, because it was really not, it was very infra-dig for a cook, a professional cook who was a member of the guild. You didn't write down your secrets. You know, your professional secrets. So the tradition of writing down recipes, there are very few recipes. On the other hand, you know, in Europe there's a lot of cookery books, but sometimes you don't know whether it's just the chef showing off how much was actually meant to eat. So recipe books have sort of a negative and a positive side. Yeah, it is a bit scant, the actual recipes, but for example, Hedda Reiner Kiel in one of her articles, for example, there's a burek. Now, burek is, you know, that very thin pastry, yufka, you make it in layers, and usually it's got a filling of cheese or mincemeat, and onion is the one that the population were eating if you bought some or you made it at home. Quite simple, really. But at the palace, they've got, in one of her documents in the margin, they put the list of some of the ingredients, and it included things like dried apricots and cinnamon and things like that. So it's the same basic food, but a sophisticated version. So you do get, you can find out quite a lot about palace cuisine if you're prepared to sort of look in the nooks and crannies of the sources. And later on you do get quite a few recipe books in the 19th century, and quite often they say palace, this is the palace way. The palace way to make this, the palace way to do that. So, yeah.
Do we have a sense of the quantities of materials that went into
That's
it?
easy because they have all these accounts.
Right.
So the
must have been
quantities
massive,
of the materials is, that's no problem, right?
But it must have been absolutely huge, presumably, for the entire harem and all the guards, etc.
Yeah, huge quantities, huge. And yes, of course, because they fed thousands of people at the palace. Thousands and thousands. Of course, most of them were just eating quite sort of simple stuff. You're not going to feed, you know, dried apricots and almonds to the, you know, to the guy who's guarding the gate, are you? But
and were there some foods especially selected for the palace, such as the mastika gum from Chios Island?
ah, yes, things like that. Yes, they got the first pick of those things, didn't they? That kind of the best went to the palace. So you've got the best of everything, and not just in the Ottoman Empire. So they're buying things like mango preserve came from India, and all this exotic stuff, like musk from Tibet, and ambergris. You know, these very expensive luxury products, of course, are coming. And things like okra became terribly popular in the 17th century. So if there isn't enough of it, they say all the okra that comes in, we have first pick. Those traders weren't allowed to sell it to anybody else. So the palace went in first, they picked the best out of the harvest, and then what's left goes on the open market. Things like that. Like Turkish delight, for example, that was turns out it was definitely a palace invention. Of course, there are lots of things before that. You can see the connection. It was a more sophisticated version of other things. But there's a document from 1790, I think, or 1780, and they say we tried to stop the confectioners' shops in town from producing Turkish delight because it's our palace thing, but they couldn't stop them.
And so it's baklava owns this Ottoman cuisine. So which, because there are countries, then which region did it first start?
Yes, well, the idea of those very thin, very thinly rolled out bread, you can sort of trace that to nomadic, Central Asian culture, because there's a 15th century traveller, French traveller, and he sees some Turkish nomads, and the ladies are rolling out these same things, because you make, your wraps, right? So that's a simple food for because you don't need an oven, and if you're a nomad, the last thing you have in the oven, you just have a little fire, you put your metal plate on top of it, you cook your very thin bread, and then you wrap it up. So that sort of layered idea is very practical for a nomadic culture, and you have bureks in Central Asia, quite early ones. But the baklava, it becomes a big deal in the 15th century, as far as we know. That's when it turns up in a poem, and then you hear the multi-layered baklava that they're feeding to people at royal celebrations. So obviously it became more and more and more, the thinner and thinner and thinner, and more layers, and the palace, because the palace cooks were the best of the best, right? Best cooks, the best ingredients, the more time, you've got a load of skivvies to do the stir things for 3 hours, which a housewife could never do, but in a rich man's kitchen or the palace, you could, however hard and laborious the thing is, you've got somebody to do it, right? And obviously that's what we know as baklava today, is a very sophisticated version of something that was probably a bit simpler in the beginning. Early 15th century is first mentioned. Yeah.
So do you think that Manta was a predecessor of Italian ravioli?
Yeah, I think so. I would think so, because Manta goes back a very long way to Central Asia. You can find recipes. I think it was that Chinese specialist Anderson. He's an anthropologist.
Anderson Baker,
what's his first name? I think he's in that Stanford University, maybe. A China expert. Anyway, they translated this soup for a Khan, which was the 13th century Mongol rulers of China, and that has manta in it. But of course, they did have pasta in medieval Italy too. But I would have thought the packages because they're so similar, aren't they? It does does lead one to think that perhaps the stuff but who knows, you can never see these things exactly. Yeah.
Yes, the relationship between these cultures and food is fascinating, because now let's say the Rum and the Turkish population, leaving aside the Kızılbaş and the Armenians, would be in the habit of visiting each other anyway on the respective festival days.
They're visiting each other.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the Rum would have known exactly what they were eating in the Turkish villages, and likewise the Turk would know exactly what the Rum population were eating on their bayrams. So because terms of some kind of distinctive cuisine, in some respects remaining, if only because of dietary restrictions. I mean, you wouldn't obviously expect to get pork if you were visiting a Sunni village from very early on.
No.
At least not on a public day. And I'm thinking therefore that there must have been a very, very easy way that these foods, even before these great international movements emerged, could have spread.
Yes, definitely.
Because the rooms are talking to the Turks, and then the rooms are talking.
Yes, because in fact, when you look at the sort of, especially the travel accounts, really there's very little difference between them, except as you say, they're sharing, and it's a give and take all the time, isn't it? Like the zeytinyağlı vegetable dishes they have in Turkey, which you eat sort of lukewarm or cold, no meat. And it's very obviously that that's a Christian fasting dish, but the vegetable cook, so it's sort of everybody's contributed, and you end up with something. Of course, you get something very, very, very interesting out of the interchange.
But nevertheless, Greek food took on a slightly different direction. So it's a question of whether when that happened, really,
yes.
or whether it was indigenous Greek cuisine that was just overlaid by the Ottoman cuisine.
Yes, I mean, there's an interesting account of some battle. Who did that? Semih Tezcan wrote something. The early Ottoman period, and there's an account of sort of a battle and what the Byzantines are eating, and because they're eating pork and crab, sort of, oh my God, sort of thing, and they're listing what they're eating, and because you can see a huge difference. But that's very early period, and then things like cabbage. Of course, they didn't have cabbage. The cabbage was a much earlier thing that the Turks adopted. But I think they gradually sort of the things exchanged a lot, but the Christian fasting periods were really just horrendous. I looked up, I looked on the internet. I asked some Greek and Armenian people because they don't keep those fasts now. The people I talk to, but it was half the year, 6 months of the year. They're not eating any meat, any dairy products. They're not even eating fish except on St. Mary's, something for 2 weeks. The rest of the time, no, not even fish. Very, very severe fasting, unbelievable. I mean, it really affected the way you could eat. I mean, you can't imagine not eating dairy products and meat for 6 months of the year. Incredible.
Well, very healthy babies.
Yes, that's why they went for vegetables. I suppose they became very inventive over their vegetables, yeah.
That's very interesting, because Bulgarian cuisine today, of course, is marked by the astonishing plethora of vegetables.
Which?
Bulgarian.
Yeah.
No doubt, as you could have taken, Bulgarian food words are almost always Turkish words.
Yes.
For obvious reasons. But nevertheless, the distinctive difference is the amount of raw vegetables or salad vegetables which they eat. And it occurred to me before that that's because of the very strong Christian tradition there.
Yes, it could be. Yes, the salads. Almost, yes, that's probably something.
One can sit down and eat 6 salads and they regard that as actually a meal.
Really?
Yes.
In Bulgaria? That's amazing, isn't it? Yes. Yeah. Yes, I mean, it's quite, because you can sort of try to unravel the different strands, and up to a point you can find quite a lot of interesting information.
Very much.
Yes.
Very interesting. We need to go after all this appetite. We have to brush through it. Boring, but
yes,
thank you.
Any more questions for us?
I'm kind of. I see. My favorite food is dessert. Is tavuk göğsü, the chicken breast, and that to me represents like really Turkish. Because even the Greeks don't do that. So do we know the origin of that?
Yeah,
because
it's an Arab. It was a milk pudding, and they sometimes enriched it with, very finely divided chicken meat, and that's an Arab thing. And the Europeans also adopted that, but I'm not quite sure how the route it took. But in the 17th century you can find recipes for that in English.
Wow.
But the only place in the world that still makes it is Turkey.
Right.
Is that right? Arab countries don't make it anymore?
No, as far as I know, it's only Turkey makes it, and yet it was. You can find recipes for it in medieval Arab cookery books in 17th century. The English cookery books, they adopted it from the Arabs, of course.
But it was also rather well known in Roman times, so I always thought it was passed.
I think that is as far as I know, that is not true actually, that the Romans had it, because it's from that Apicius book.
But yes, you must have come across it during your research.
Yeah, but you know, sometimes people say things about Apicius, and I haven't got the sources to check, but what I seem to remember is that in fact Apicius doesn't have anything resembling that. Somebody thought it did, and then you know how people repeat things. I don't think Apicius had anything really comparable to that pudding. I think it was definitely an Arab origin, but I have to leave a little window in case I'm mistaken, but that's what I remember. Because about Apicius you find a lot of things, people sort of talk off the top of their hats about it. You know, they think, oh, it's similar because it's got sesame seeds in it, but then when you look at the recipe carefully, there aren't really any parallels sometimes. What is a very, you can see from Roman recipes, is this idea of putting syrup on puddings. That is definitely a Roman thing.
Oh, really?
Definitely. But they used honey, obviously they didn't have sugar. Yeah.
So, our famous simit, has it actually started from the Ottoman Empire times, or?
Yeah, that might be going back much, much earlier, because you know the Hittites, bread was a really big deal in those ancient civilizations. You know, it's what you gave to the gods was bread and wine. And the Hittites, you know, somebody produced from the Hittite tablets, there's a lot of food which is not actually, they're not really recipes for home cooking, they're recipes for what you give up to the gods, and probably the priests ate it, probably a lot of it. I think about 75% of those recipes are bread. Bread, you know, round bread, triangular bread, this bread, bread cut bread with nuts, bread with seeds on top, bread this, bread that. Just millions of guys, different shaped breads. You know, those in those Egyptian tombs, they've got some bread that's sort of fossilised in the British Museum and the Metropolitan Museum. They've got all kinds of shapes of bread, but maybe not. But I'm pretty sure that the Hittites may have had also those rings, bread rings, because they were so inventive over their bread. It's unbelievable. Because it's almost a sacred thing, bread, isn't it? Because you're farmers and you're dependent on the gods for making sure you get a good crop of wheat, and wheat's the big thing. So you want the gods to be really happy with your wheat crop. And your bread. Yeah.
Sort of logistics question.
Yes.
So you said that there's this culture of sending gifts of food,
yes,
often across great distances.
Yes.
You said even to China, across deserts.
Yeah, unbelievable.
How do they make sure that everything was kept fresh?
Yeah, well, I think there's keeping it in lead chests with snow in it, I think was used for some foods, like watermelons they sent also long distances from sort of North Iran to Lord knows where across Central Asia. And I think also the varieties were keeping varieties, you know, like you have melons that you just have to eat them when they're ripe, and you have melons that, you know, if you hang them on a string they'll keep all winter. I would guess that those grapes and those watermelons were the kinds that would also keeping kinds. But I don't know quite how much more information there is on that.
The lead doesn't sound too healthy. The lead doesn't sound too healthy.
Doesn't really, does it? But maybe, yeah, perhaps they weren't aware of it then. There is, I think it's a Chinese source talking about the lead chests. Maybe it's sort of kept cold. Maybe. Yeah.
I think when the Turkish ambassador visited Queen Elizabeth I's court, I think there was a recipe that he did. They prepared Turkish kebabs for them, and there's an Elizabethan recipe. I think they call them kebabs or something like that.
Yes. What, in Elizabethan period,
yes,
teapots, and from Turkey?
Yes, the Turkish
Oh,
ambassadors.
yes.
There's a lot of to and fro
Yes,
between the
yes.
two courts. I just wondered why the tradition didn't carry on.
Yeah, sort of interesting, isn't it?
Mm.
Yes. Yes, I think the idea of barbecuing really was very foreign to.
Yeah.
You know, you think it was a very basic cooking thing, wouldn't you, barbecuing? And the Greeks had it. I think ancient Greeks had barbecuing. Because Nicholas Nicolai in the 16th century says, oh, they cook food on, they have this sort of, charcoal, and they put a wire thing on top, and they cook food on it, as if it was something he'd never seen in his life. So maybe that's why things didn't really catch on. Because in England especially, you had to have a joint, didn't you? You had to have a joint. That was all the, wasn't it the French who called the English, they called them the roast beefs, right? And the English called the French the frogs. Because for English people, the idea of sort of having little bits of meat, that wasn't the thing, was it? It wasn't the British thing. You had hunks, right? Yeah.
It might be a relevant question, but I mean, right now the Turks are obsessed with tea, right? And you really don't know when it came into play. Actually, was it something from the Ottoman times, or is it rather recent? Do you think?
Tea. Somebody I don't know an awful lot about the subject, but just by accident last weekend I was there was several people talking, and one of them, the subject got onto tea. Eileen Tan, actually, she knows a lot about it. Of course, tea is a very late thing. I mean, it's late everywhere except for the Chinese, isn't it? It's only quite late that it spread into sort of Russia and India and whatever. And it came to Turkey very late. I think they tried to grow tea in the late Ottoman period. Perhaps because coffee became expensive, because they stopped being able to get Yemen coffee, became very rare. Only the Sultan and a few rich people could get Yemen coffee. So you had to buy it from the Europeans from Brazil. It became expensive. Maybe they thought tea would be a good substitute, but I think they didn't even get going, and I don't think they really got going with tea until the 20th century.
Tea is above all a Republican invention. In the village where I worked, for example, they have very, very clear memories that even in their time they had no tea, and instead at breakfast time they would drink soup, and then if they felt for any reason they wanted it, they could of course have as many different kinds of herbal tea as they wanted. They could just pick any kind of grass from around the village. But the idea of actually drinking tea is fantastically recent.
Actually, I mean, we know that like 1925 is a time when the state just started planting teas and so on. But what astonishes me is the tradition just developed around tea right now. I mean, when you go to a regular house, if you're not served tea like in 15 minutes, it's a problem and so on. And it's so much in essential in the culture. So I'm just trying to understand how this happened in like.
I suppose it was a substitute for coffee, because when the Turkish Republic was founded, Turkey was in a bad state economically, so really trying to avoid imports. So I suppose the idea of substituting an imported coffee for locally tea is really a big important thing. So I suppose it took the place of coffee, I would say. Apparently the glasses, there was this chap from Izmir, Ege University there, he said those, the special glasses they have in Turkey for tea, that's sort of, I like those very much. I didn't realize, he said they come from Iran, that shape of glass.
Mine's turned off.
Yeah.
But this is discussed in a book by Chris Ham, called Tea and the Domestication of the Turkish State, published in about 1988 by the Eothen Press.
Who was it you said?
Chris Hahn.
He's the director of the Max Planck Institute of Ethnology in Halle.
Yes.
And it's called Tea and the Domestication of the Turkish State. And basically what he's saying is that you're absolutely right. The process you described is absolutely right, but additionally, it was a way of expressing egalitarianism between citizens.
Because it's cheap, much cheaper.
The villagers could afford it, that's
yes.
whereas they certainly wouldn't have been able to afford coffee.
No.
Actually, this also supports the use of maybe you heard of it, menengiç kahvesi,
Yes.
which is made out of chickpeas, just resembles the taste of the coffee, but it's in southeastern Turkey, which is easier to afford basically.
But there's loads of those substitutes of the menengiç, which is turpentine. Was it turpentine tree fruit or something? What was the English?
Terebinth.
Huh?
Terebinth?
Terebinth, that's it. But there's many things. Yeah, the chickpeas and stuff when substitutes. I don't think they taste anything like coffee. They're not disappointing, but
It's just once in a year.
yeah, if you're really stuck for coffee.
There's quite an art to making coffee.
Yes.
Unfortunately, people are using electric coffee machines.
Yeah,
Turkish coffee is not the same.
yeah. A really nice Turkish coffee is so wonderful, isn't it?
Yeah, of course, there are regional distinctions in Turkish food, which of course are fading a bit now, but they existed very strongly until recently. And also that different restaurants have serve different kinds of food as well. And,
Yes.
and that, I suppose, has to be factored into all this, because those differences would have existed in Ottoman times very strongly, more strongly, obviously. You know, so you wouldn't have got, izgara and kebabs, I suppose, nearly as much in the west of Turkey as you would have done in eastern Turkey.
Well, the kebabs, you say. Well, that's what some person. I think it was. I can't remember who it was. Somebody began this thing. They said Istanbul cuisine has become degenerate because of kebabs. And you look back in history. No, kebabs were always a big deal. The best kind of meat served at the palace, it was either you turned a chicken or whatever on a spit, or you ate kebabs. They were a big thing. They were being sold in the street. They were eaten at the palace. It was a big thing, but for some reason, I don't know, Istanbul people suddenly got this idea, and I'm sure it's just that one guy, some article he wrote in the 1970s or something, saying that it was, the southeastern Turkey brought their kebabs and they wrecked Istanbul cuisine, and it's not true. Kebabs were a big thing always, and doner certainly began in Istanbul, it seems. That's how the evidence points, because there's some early 17th century, 1611 miniature paintings showing doner kebab, the horizontal spit, not the vertical spit, and it was a picnic food, and that was an elite. I mean, it's a miniature painting. You're in a miniature painting, they're showing elite figures having a fancy picnic with a cook turning the spit of the doner. I mean,
Sure, it's not cockroach.
No,
It's Giacomo, actually.
it's
The flat one is cooked.
It's a doner.
because cockroach is very thin, you can tell, and it's just
In the
like the
miniature.
doner, fat in the middle, becoming, shorter towards the end. It's very obvious that it's doner. And the Sultan was eating doner when Abdulaziz, he was keen on food. When he visited Eyüp, he would immediately order kebab from the local kebab house. He wasn't above eating kebab from the kebab house.
If this commentary arose from, would you say, the early 70s, about this becoming degenerate,
Yes.
might that have coincided with the arrival of fast food and it being considered as a fast food, and therefore itself would be considered degenerate, so there was a guilt by association effect, perhaps?
Yeah, maybe, the fact, could be.
I would also say that would also be relevant to faster urbanization of Istanbul from rural areas, and that also coincides with 70s and 80s. And lahmacun is the other blame taker actually in that one.
Yes, okay, lahmacun did come later, but it's not that different from pide. I love lahmacun.
I mean, there's a shop over there in Bush Street actually.
I do remember my mother visiting her English sister-in-law, who offered her something to eat for lunch, and my mother said no thank you, because she was expecting to be asked about 5 times, but she wasn't. We went home hungry, and I remember my husband, who is English, sometimes he says that he does find Turkish hospitality a little bit overwhelming. Yes.
But we see this parallel in now invented Terry Wogan with the phrase, "You'll have had your tea then," when the visitor arrives, which is the other end of the spectrum.
That's not the Turkish way.
Yeah, I know what I'm saying.
Yeah,
I've been overwhelmed by food
Yeah.
before I learned that you just ate a little.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, so after they get to know you, after a number of years, then you go back to the English way. You haven't really no thanks. It's partly a question of formality.
Well, you make it, that's a very interesting point, because we were visiting the Mediterranean coast on one occasion. We fell into a conversation with a family from Turkey as well.
Yes.
And in talking with him, he said, in order to get to know somebody, you have to eat a lot of salt. And basically, sitting over a meal, talking gradually. And to me, that's an excellent phrase. You have to eat a lot of salt, because you're not going to do it rapidly.
Yeah,
So I love the expression.
yeah, interesting. That's a good phrase.
A friend of mine who knows Italy really well said the only place in Italy that does stuffed mussels, media dolma, is Genoa.
Yes.
And the story is because it was brought by the Italian mariners who had a colony in Galata. But the question is, did it go west or did it go east? So
Yeah, I think that because it's got rice in it, it is it definitely went from east to west. It must have done, because every single dolma, the basic is rice, and then some other ingredients added to it. So I can't see that would, but like you can tell from risotto, it's the Italian attempt to make pilau, right?
I'm not sure. But I mean,
Well,
if you go back to Neil Markham's recent book,
Yeah.
what's it called, Agents of Empire? I mean, you'll see then that the interweaving, or the interwovenness of those cultures is absolutely fantastic, right from Italy through the Balkans into Istanbul.
Yes.
And all these Levantine peoples, they know each other intimately. Here we're not talking about formalised byline visiting, we're talking about absolutely living cheek by jowl over centuries.
Yes.
And I think it's probably better to think in terms of a broadly shared culinary culture, which then after that takes on its regional hues.
Yes, I mean, I see what you mean exactly, but why I'm pretty sure about the rice is because there are some Italian banquets for, is it este, this big Italian sort of aristocrat, este somebody. Anyway, I think it's very early, either late 15th century or early 16th century, and he and he's married this French aristocrat, and they have this gigantic banquet, and they have something called Turkish rice in that banquet, and it's a kind of rice pudding, and they call that Turkish rice, and the fact that they don't seem to have, there's no trace on those fancy menus of anything else made with rice. There's only that Turkish rice, which is sweet with cinnamon on top. That makes me think they didn't have a rice culture at that point.
So the Byzantines and the
I
Romans,
don't think.
they didn't have rice in Roman times?
Yeah, I think it wasn't completely unknown, but I think as part of their culinary culture, it was still something. Somebody did a big research into the spread of rice, like the Ottomans brought rice very early to the Balkans. But I don't think the Byzantines knew rice. But I don't think they had a sort of a culture of it in there. It was sort of an exotic thing. That's what I sort of remember from reading.
I can believe it, foods do get adopted at different social strata.
Yes, we don't, yes. I have to look at Andrew Darby's books a bit more about try to find out when things arrived.
Because I think these food cultures are absolutely fascinating. There isn't, as far as I know, a really good book on 20th century Turkish food culture, with relating very strongly to the social context and the way people are dividing up the foods. I've always wished that somebody would go do it. It's an ideal subject for a PhD student. And it's rather difficult today to do Turkey, some kinds of research in Turkey today, but one could still do a food project with the greatest of ease.
Yeah, you could. Yes, these sort of prejudices and assumptions and
well, I mean, literally, the indigenous food categories when you divide things up, and the way that you generate the foods between soon you make another kind of food, for example. I mean, Caroline, you have lots of young people passing through your doors in Caroline, Istanbul. Can't you find some young person to do a book on?
No, you suggested it. There's lots of young people like that, that's for sure.
Yes, because it changed so much. Of course, the Western influence has been so heavy, but not in homes really. I mean,
you can still do it, but and after all, people change more slowly than culture. So, I mean, there'll be lots and lots of people who remember it more or less before modernity.
Yes, sure. Yes. And it was sort of a bit, the changes are quite slow in the home, aren't they? Whereas in restaurants, you know, I mean, there was a time I remember you couldn't get a Turkish pudding in a fancy, in a hotel or a Turkish restaurant. You couldn't get a Turkish coffee if you went to Divan Hotel in Istanbul. They gave you Nescafe.
Oh, right.
Yes.
Yeah, that went on for ages.
Yeah.
It would be infradig. I mean, to offer Turkish coffee, wouldn't it? Now you wouldn't dream of serving Nescafe in a fancy hotel.
Now it's what's called cafe au lait, isn't it?
Oh, that's true.
Yes, that's it.
Americano.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. It's been absolutely fascinating. We've all learned a very, very great deal. It's an extraordinary community.
Oh, I'm so glad it was.